Hello and welcome to the WARC Podcast. My name's David Tiltman and today we are talking about behavioural science and how it's been applied to marketing. We have author and researcher Richard Shotton in the studio with us to talk about his new book, Hacking the Human Mind. And this is one of those occasions where you can watch us as well as listen. We've recorded this as a video podcast available on WARC's YouTube feed. Now, behavioural science has been a topic of enduring fascination for marketers, and for obvious reasons. If you want to influence consumer behaviour, it helps to know some of the ways humans actually behave. But it's not always been easy to find real-world applications of the science or to translate the theory into practice. We're going to be talking with Richard about some of those challenges, and we'll be diving into some examples from the book that show how major brands have applied some of the thinking. We'll be talking about brands that have really understood factors like pricing, purchase timing, distinctiveness, and even humble wordplay to find success. So, Richard, welcome to the WARC Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. Good to be here.
I'm sure many of our listeners, or indeed viewers, are aware of you, have read some of your work before. But for anyone who isn't, just give us a quick rundown of your background and how you started looking and getting really sort of quite deeply involved in this sort of area of behavioural science.
Yeah. So generally in life, I think these interest areas that you adopt and enthuse about, you generally just drift into them. But for me, there was a very, very specific moment when I became interested in behavioural science. So it's all the way back in 2004. Briefs just landed on my desk for a client, the NHS. We were trying to encourage people to give blood. And it just so happened at that stage I was reading The Tipping Point. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the
Malcolm Gladwell?
Yeah. Huge bestseller book. And right at the back of that book, it's only a paragraph or two, but he talks about this idea called the bystander effect. Mm-hmm. So essentially, back in the 60s, two American psychologists called Latané and Dahle did loads of psychology experiments showing that if you ask lots of people to come to your aid to help you, you tend to get a diffusion of responsibility. Everyone leaves it up to someone else, and your message is ineffective. And I can remember reading that and thinking, gosh, this is exactly the problem we face when we go out and ask people to give blood. We go out as the NHS and say blood stocks are low in England and Wales. And just as Latané and Dahle suggested, most people ignore the message. Most people think, why should I go through the pain, the time, the hassle of donating blood when I know my neighbour and my neighbour's neighbour's been asked? So read that study and then thought, okay, well, why don't we apply some of the tactics Latané and Dahle talk about? So I went and spoke to the brilliant planner down at DLKW, Charlie Snow, told him about this study and said, why don't we do a little test where rather than saying blood stocks are low in England and Wales, why don't we put out messages saying blood stocks are low in Basildon or Birmingham or wherever it was? Tiny, crude change based on a very old, well-established behavioural science principle. And lo and behold, 2 weeks later, get the results back, and there's this 10 or 15% improvement in the responses. And that to me was shocking, that there was this kind of body of work out there. Bystander effect is just one of hundreds of experiments that you could take from 50 odd years ago, apply to a pressing problem, and then see a positive result. And back in 2004, I became completely enthused about this field and was just really frustrated that at the time there seemed to be no interest in learning from academics and behavioural scientists. So I've basically spent the last 21 years trying to apply findings from behavioural science, running my own experiments, but always coming back to this point of how do you take a existing insight into human behaviour that has been catalogued or researched by behavioural scientists, and how do you use that to practically solve a challenge? And the great thing for anyone who's thinking about using behavioural science is, one, this study is robust. It's based on peer-reviewed experiments. And then secondly, it's as relevant as you can get to marketing. Marketing is the business of behaviour change. Why wouldn't you draw on 130 years of experiments into what makes for effective behaviour change?
And as you've gone down that route, you've written 2 books, I think, Choice Factory, Illusion of Choice, and now the third.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about how that third book has built on the first 2.
Yeah. So third one's different because it's co-authored for a start. So it's written with Michael Eyre and Flicker. And then the other big difference is with the Choice Factory and Illusion of Choice, they're split into chapters. And for each of those books, the chapter is about a particular insight from behavioural science, a particular bias. And then I talk about what that bias is, the existing academic evidence, studies I've done to show it works commercially, and then the bulk of the chapter is what you do differently. That's the flow of the first 2. The third one, it's flipped on its head. Each chapter is about a brand. So it could be Starbucks or Haagen-Dazs or Meta, little history of that brand, and then 2 or 3 behavioural science studies that partially explain some of that business's success. So it starts with the brand and then goes on to how that business used behavioural science. So it tries to be very, very concrete, very practical, starting in the real world.
And what I think is interesting, so we're going to explore some of those examples as we go through this podcast, but I just think one of the interesting points about it is that many of these companies, whether intentionally or unintentionally, use multiple different biases. So it's not like, brand X used this bias to do this. It's that there's multiple different things going on at the same time. And I think you've talked about layering of biases. So just explain a little bit about that.
So absolutely. So any complex brand will do thousands of things, many of them concurrently. So actually trying to learn from a super successful brand is harder than it looks because not everything they do contributes to the success. Some of the actions will detract from it. So what we did first of all was look at, say, Amazon, look at all the things it does, and then filter those actions through this lens of behavioural science. And we just focus on the 2 or 3 actions that Amazon Prime take that are also proven to work in controlled peer review conditions. Now, each brand, as you say, doesn't just have one technique it uses. They might use one technique on one campaign, or they might combine techniques on another campaign.
Yeah.
So the point here is there are thousands of these biases. You don't just have to limit yourself to using one of them on any intervention. What you really want to be doing is looking, as you say, as layering on 1, maybe 2 biases to get this cumulative effect.
So we're going to get into some of these examples in a few moments. But before we do, I want to have a little chat about what you might call the state of behavioural science when it comes to marketing. Because I remember maybe 10, 12 years ago, there's a real sort of surge in interest in this space, and a lot of sort of marketers and agency people really trying to tap into some of this thinking. Now, I'm not saying that's vanished, but I think it's fair to say that outside the social, and the 2 examples you've already given are in that sort of social space, we've not necessarily seen huge numbers of examples. Now, maybe things are going on behind the scenes. Maybe it's not all finding its way into case studies, but I'm interested in understanding first the state of the academic literature, and then secondly, why you think it's so difficult to translate into real world actions.
So I mean, I disagree on that second part about the translation into real world action. I think if you look at pretty much any super successful business, there will be a use of behavioural science. All behavioural sciences, if you almost forget the label, it is the study of how to influence people to change their behaviour. How can a brand not use techniques from that field? So you say they might not do it knowingly. They might come to it through a different route. But you've got to be using these principles. What I think happens often, though, is once a behavioural principle becomes established, it stops being behavioural science being applied and it becomes common sense. So take an example, take Netflix. And in fact, we could replace Netflix with one of 1,000 e-commerce brands. You go to the website and there is a basic package, there's a premium package, and there's a super premium package. That is what a behavioural scientist would call extremeness aversion, what often gets referred to as the Goldilocks effect or the centre stage effect. And it's the finding that goes back to 1993, the work of Amos Tversky at Stanford, that if you give people three options, they tend to gravitate towards the middle. So what Tversky did was recruits a group of people, and he shows them a basic camera for $169 and a fancy camera for $239, and he asks people which they'd pick. And you get this exact 50-50 split. Gets rid of that group, gets a new group of people. They are shown exactly the same two cameras, same price, same benefits, but he also puts out a super premium $469 camera with loads of benefits. So you get 21% of people picking that super premium one. Not many people want to buy a camera for $469 in 1993. But forget about that. You're then left with that remaining 79% of people. And what you get is a split of 22% going for the cheapest, 57% going for the now middle camera. Now that is a ratio of, let's say almost, or let's just say 1 to 3. Remember, that first group saw exactly those same two cameras, same benefits, same cost, and it was 1 to 1. What Tversky shows here is people pick a product not just based on its inherent attributes, they're also deeply, deeply influenced by what something is surrounded by. So you give people three options and they gravitate to the middle because they think to themselves, well, the cheapest one's going to be poor quality, I'm going to look mean, most expensive one will be over-engineered and overpriced. Now, what Netflix and many other brands are doing is they're giving people three options. They are not trying to sell that super premium offering. What they are doing is adding it there so that it makes the now middle one look better value in comparison. Now, that idea is so commonplace amongst digital sales sites that almost people would just think it's common sense.
Yeah, it's almost obvious.
Yeah, exactly. It's obvious. So what a behavioural scientist would say is, yeah, absolutely, but it wasn't bloody obvious in 1992 before Tversky experimented on it. And actually, what most brands do is not the most recent cutting-edge research. So since Tversky did that study, 30-odd years ago, there's loads of studies about sweating out small marginal gains. So, for example, there's a study from Suckley and Lichtenstein at Colorado University where they do something called the order effect of anchoring. And what they say is it's not just the presence of a super priced item that helps sell more. What they say is it also matters in about the order in which you see these items. And their argument is it's the first thing that is most effective at changing willingness to pay. So go back to the Netflix example. Most people read left to right. What Netflix do is go good, better, best. Cheap, middle, expensive. What Suckley and Lichtenstein would say is that's the wrong way around. What you want to do is get people seeing the most expensive one first. Yeah. And that will increase willingness to pay.
They're focusing on that sort of, oh my God, that's the full fat version.
Yeah.
Oh, phew, there's a cheaper one. Yeah.
And it will vary by context, but in the Suckley and Lichtenstein study done in a bar, changing the order that the beers were laid out on the menu, going from most expensive first rather than cheapest first, it increased willingness to pay by 4%. Now, that's not going to radically change someone's business, but you've got to lay out your prices in one order. Why don't you do it in the way that maximises impact? So we're kind of long-winded way of saying, we often ignore the behavioural science principles that are used very, very regularly because they have moved into this kind of world of common sense. It doesn't stop them being a behavioural science principle.
So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in that academic world. A couple of years ago, we had the death of Daniel Kahneman, who most people is probably the name most people would associate with this sort of field. Who are the sort of people doing really interesting work at the moment?
So, I think if you look at that kind of level of impact, the person that's taken on that mantle is probably Richard Thaler. So Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in 2002, died last year at the age of 90. Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize in 2017. So I think if you're looking at that completely kind of upper echelon of people who've made huge differences, it would be Thaler and the like. In terms of the type of thing that's interesting, I think that there's two ways of looking at that. The first is there are interesting areas of research, like how some of these experiments and biases, how their impact varies by type of person. I think that's a massively interesting area of exploration. But the other way of looking at that is to push back on the premise of the question, which is that people should be fixated on what's new. I think marketers are fascinated by the latest new thing. And it's part of our characters, I think. I think people who are lovers of interesting new things get attracted to the industry. But the danger with that is we tend to ignore the longer, more established insights, which I think will tend to have the biggest effect. So really what you should be basing your plan around is not the intellectually exciting latest discovery. It's which of these insights is going to have the biggest impact in the business. And it's often the older ones that have the larger impact, partly because they're more likely to be robust. Like if a new finding's discovered in 2025, if it was published last week, there's only been a week for other academics to try and pick holes in that idea. If you look at a principle like distinctiveness, you can go back to the work of Hedwig von Restorff in 1933, social proof, goes back to a similar era. Because they've been around for 90 years, they are very robust. Because if they are still standing, still believed 90 years later, that has been 90 years of opportunity for academics to pick holes and disprove them. And secondly, the stuff that was discovered early on in modern psychology and model behavioural science, often where people worked was in the areas that had the biggest impacts. So they're more easier to uncover. And often if you look at studies which try and rank the relative impact of these ideas, it's often the classic ones, the most well-known ones that come out top: social proof, scarcity. So in many ways, I'd say to marketers, almost forget about the recent stuff. Go back and look at the real fundamentals and make sure they are being applied to their maximum usage.
And just on that point about academics being able to pick holes in new theory, there was a whole thing in psychology a decade ago, the replication crisis, where the classic studies were, people couldn't recreate them in modern conditions. Did any of that affect any of the sort of work in behavioural science? What's your take from that sort of crisis?
So the replication crisis, if people haven't heard of it, it's the idea that academics would go back and look at other studies, rerun them and see if they could find the results. And the crisis part is that many studies didn't show the same results. Now, psychology, saying like 50% of papers replicate. It's about the same as economics. It's about the same as oncology, the study of cancer. Now, move away from marketing onto something like oncology and think how you would want someone to interpret that data. Let's say a patient discovers they've got cancer. What would be an insane reaction on their part is to think some oncology papers don't replicate. I'm therefore going to ignore the entire canon of Western medicine and I'm going to cure this problem with coffee enemas or homeopathy. That would be insanity. What they should do is think, okay, some oncology papers don't replicate. I want to make bloody sure that the doctor who is setting up my treatment program knows which ones replicate and they focus all their efforts in those areas. That is exactly the same with behavioural science. The more studies that get disprove, the better, because what it leaves behind is a purer, more rigorous,
more robust core
hub, nub or whatever. Yes. The act of disproving things is bloody brilliant. Where the problem comes is there's this kind of like zombie studies disproved ages ago, and yet people still keep on quoting them. The problem isn't that studies get debunked. The problem is if people keep on using debunked studies. So just make sure that whatever principle you are using is one of that remaining 50%, not the froth and the rubbish. The only thing I would say is I always find it a strange question from marketers about the replication crisis, because the reason marketing doesn't have a replication crisis isn't because everything that marketers say is true. It's because no one bothers replicating anything. We think of all these kind of studies that we repeat again and again, often coming from companies that have a vested interest to sell a particular medium. When is that methodology opened up to public scrutiny, and when are they rerun? The good thing with behavioural science is we know the studies that are debunked. With marketing, we have no bloody idea which ones are true and which ones aren't.
Interesting, thank you. All right, let's talk about some of the actual examples from the book then, because I want to dive into a few of the different areas. And the first one I'm going to pick is the one around Red Bull. For those who not familiar with Red Bull, the caffeine-infused soft drink.
Where's this being broadcast in like Antarctica to some penguins?
Well, you never know. We do have a global audience here. Now, the specific thing I want to talk about Red Bull that comes through very strongly in the book is how they thought about pricing. And price is clearly a hugely interesting issue for marketers at the moment. We've seen lots of interest in the relationship between brand strength and pricing and those sorts of things. But this was a slightly different approach to pricing. And so I wonder if you can just explain the different biases that are going on within your Red Bull example and how they relate to pricing.
Yeah. So this insight was very much inspired by Rory Sutherland, who's a brilliant behavioural scientist. And one of the ideas that he's talked about before that I've picked up on is this idea of price relativity. Mm-hmm. So it's essentially the argument that when people are trying to work out what is a fair price to pay for something, like what is a fair price to pay for this microphone, what people don't do is think, how many units of happiness is the microphone going to generate? And then they refer to their kind of textbook in their head, which says, well, normally we are happy paying £1 per unit of happiness. Microphone will give us 200 units, therefore it's worth £200. People don't do that because it's a ludicrously complex calculation.
And the other thing they don't do, of course, is work out the cost of all the raw materials and go, oh, this must have cost about £20 to produce.
Yes, therefore I'll give them a nice 15% margin and it'll be so on and so forth. So what people are constantly doing is replacing these complex questions with simpler ones. And the simple way of working out what is a fair price to pay for this microphone is to think, what have I paid for other microphones? So let's say standard microphone is £50. This one has extra features. It has a particularly fluffy boom thingy and a nice coloured wire. Because it's a little bit nicer, I'm going to pay a little bit more. I'm going to pay £55. That's how people work things out in the real world. Now, that might sound completely speculative, but I've done a few studies to test this. So one of them, and this might be a bit British, but I think people will still understand, it was looking at how much people are prepared to pay for tea.
Mm-hmm. Very important topic in Britain.
So I'll try and, the numbers will be directionally right. Showed people a box of Tesco tea, so basic supermarket own label,
private label tea.
£1, and PG Tips, kind of mid-market brand for £2. Yeah. And I said to people, how good value is the PG Tips? So they got the price, the weight, and then these two brands. Let's say 40% of people said PG Tips is good value. Get rid of that group of people. Completely fresh group of people, that's the key bit. They are shown exactly the same cardboard tub of PG Tips, exactly the same price of £2, but the comparison set is now Twinings for £3.49.
Upmarket
tea fancy.
For our non-tea drinking.
Yes, yeah, very good point. Now the proportion of people who think PG Tips is good value goes up to about 60%. Now the interesting thing here is people are seeing exactly the same product, exactly the same price, but whether they think it's good or bad value depends on what it's compared to. That's the underlying point. The underlying point is prices are viewed relatively, not absolutely. Now, if a marketer believes that, then suddenly they have so many opportunities because the mental comparison set for your product is not fixed. You can adjust it. And Red Bull is an absolutely classic example of shifting cleverly your mental comparison set. So go back to when Red Bull launched. What I think 99.9% of brands would have done is launch a soft drink in a 330ml squat can that every other soft drink was in. You know, those
standard
Coke cans, exactly. Now, if they had done that, the argument from this principle of price relativity would have been the comparisons for Red Bull would have been the price of Pepsi and Coke. And if you remember, Red Bull wanted, let's say, £1 when they launched. A can of Coke cost about 30 pence. The argument would have been no one would have paid that because it would have felt astronomically expensive compared to Coke. People might have said, okay, well, this Red Bull stuff, it gives me energy, it's more functional. Maybe it's worth paying more than 30 pence. I might pay 35, I might pay 40 pence. It would have been compared to this benchmark of Coke's price. But what they did is counterintuitively, they shrink the can. It's now a 250 milliliter can. And it is extended, so it's a tall, thin can. It looks completely different. So suddenly, people's comparison set is no longer tethered to Tango and Pepsi. Now it's free running.
It's kind of created a category of its own.
Exactly.
With its own category
So
cues.
now it can introduce a price and not be held back by the behaviour of others. And if you think about that, it's actually a remarkably commonplace thing lots of brands have done, that they break the comparison set and then they change willingness to pay. I think that of all the things Red Bull did was the bit of genius that gave them the head start, that gave them these massive profit margins, that then allowed them to send people up into the sky, that then allowed them to write these amazing strap lines they've done.
You mentioned sending people up into the sky, and you talk about costly signalling in the book as well. Another thing that Red Bull have lent into. So just explain that.
So costly signalling, it's an idea that actually originates from biology rather than psychology. And the original academic was an Israeli called Amos Zahavi. Mm-hmm. And he was inspired by something Charles Darwin wrote. Charles Darwin was puzzled by the length of the peacock's tail. So essentially, Darwin was perplexed. He thinks like, why does a peacock have a long tail? Because the long tail makes it easier to be caught by a predator. Therefore, surely, over time, evolution should have bred peacocks so they lose this tail and have a nice, small, stubby one that means they can still fly very quickly. And Zahavi thought about this problem, and he begins to get to the idea that the value of the peacock's tail is that it is a genuine, costly signal to peahens that the peacock has superior genes, that the peacock is fast, it's clever, it's agile, that it can evade the predators even though
despite
it has
its tail.
Exactly. But the point is, it's an unfakeable signal. The point is that it's not the peacock going out and saying, I'm agile, I'm clever, I'm fast. Any peacock could say that, assuming peacocks could talk, but any peacock could try and claim that, but it would mean nothing because a weak peacock could claim it, a fast peacock could claim it. Only though a genuinely genetically fit peacock could have this long cumbersome tail and still get to mating age. So Zahavi talks about this in biology, and then a certain group of academics. So it was John Kay, who's at Oxford, and interestingly, Evan Davis on the BBC.
Oh, from the BBC.
Who wrote many a brilliant paper before he went to the BBC. They start applying this idea to advertising. They start saying maybe advertising is like a peacock's tail. It's not enough just for someone to say their product is amazing, because both good and bad actors would say that. What you need to do is identify an expensive, costly signal that acts as a screening mechanism. Only someone with genuine faith in their product would spend extravagantly on advertising, because the person with the crap product, the charlatan, they would know, well, expensive advertising only pays off in the long term. And an extravagant thing like sending someone up to the moon, well, I might get someone to try my product once, but if it's a shoddy product, they're not going to come back. They're not going to have positive word of mouth. You would only do those type of advertising behaviours if you knew your product was so good it would generate positive word of mouth, so good that people would return to it again and again. So the wonderful thing is there is this argument that even in an era of procurement, there are really solid benefits to extravagance and excess spend, because it gives this unfakeable signal that you actually believe in the long-term brilliance of your brand.
Now, sticking with pricing, you did some work with another brand in the Lions portfolio, Acuity Pricing, and you looked there at some other sort of more everyday kind of price signals. I think like charm pricing, for example. And that's been like a staple of retail and marketing for years, that something is $2.99 rather than $3 or £3. Why is that such a enduring piece of wisdom?
Yeah. So there's two arguments. So firstly, charm pricing is the idea that people treat £1.99 fundamentally different from £2. So even though there's only a penny difference, which would be a 0.5% difference in price, if you drop down below that threshold, you'll get more than 0.5% increase in sales. There's some work done with supermarkets that suggests that 1 penny drop could all boost sales by 10 to 15%. Now, why it happens is disputed. So there's two separate arguments. There's one argument which is called the left-hand digit bias. So if you're in a supermarket and you're busy and you're distracted, you see something for £1.99. The argument is you don't really think of it as £1.99. You just encode it simply in mind as one something. If you see something for £2 or £2.15 or £2.99, you just see it as two something. So cost in people's mind doesn't go up in this kind of regular manner. There are these steps in terms of perceived pain of a price. So what you really want to do is be just below, as a brand, those threshold costs. That's the left-hand digit bias argument. Some people argue it's more than that. It's the argument that over time, people have fused the idea of being on sale, being in a bargain basement type retailer with 99 pence, because that's the kind of place that uses it. Determining which of those two is key, I think, is quite hard. But what we see again and again is, even though the first retailers did this in the 19th century, it still has an effect today. Uber's a brilliant behavioural science case study. They had a big behavioural science department. It was led by a very prestigious psychologist or behavioural scientist called John List. And one of the things that he did, I think he's at the University of Chicago now, but before he left, is he did a test with surge pricing. And what he showed was three things, or had three sets. So you and I could be standing at a road. We are both waiting for a taxi, waiting for an Uber, and you're served a surge price at 2x, so double normal price. I'm served the same ride, but at 1.9x. And what he showed was, just as charm pricing suggests, I would be far, far more likely to take the ride.
1.9x and 2x. It's annoying, but it's only 0.9 above the...
Yes, exactly. And you would expect, standard pricing would suggest, well, it is cheaper, you should get more demand. But it was out of kilter with the scale of the reduction. But the really interesting bit was they had a third group, so some poor guy over here, where he is served a surge price at 2.1x, so the most expensive of all. Now, he was slightly less likely to take it than me, but he would be more likely to take the ride than you, who got the surge price at 2x. Exactly. So the argument there is not between charm prices any longer. It's between a round price, 2x, and what's known as a precise price, 2.1x.
Because a round price sounds arbitrary, whereas an exact price feels like it's calculated through some mechanism that makes it fair.
Exactly. And because of the distrust of any commercial organisation, if something feels like it's arbitrary, people assume it has arbitrarily landed on something that is beneficial to the brand rather than the consumer. So you've got this lovely set of experiments that suggest that if anyone is ever selling a product for £10 or £100 or £1, this kind of arbitrary round number, they have a wonderful opportunity not only to increase margin, but also to increase demand by just edging it up slightly. So if you're a consultant, never sell your wares at £1,000, sell them at £1,053.50. The precision will mean that your price feels, and that's the important thing, it feels like it's better value.
Okay, so sticking with, in a loosest possible sense, pricing, another example from the book is Klarna, which is the buy now, pay later sort of finance company. You talk about purchase timing as being a bias. It kind of sounds obvious, but just talk to us a little bit about why this is powerful.
So there's two very related ideas behind Klarna. One's this idea of the present bias, sometimes known as present preference bias, sometimes known as hyperbolic discounting. And it's the argument that people are very concerned about pleasure or pain in the immediate now or in the immediate future. They are much less concerned about pleasure or pain in the distant future. Now, every economist would recognise that there should be this decline in value of future goods. The point from behavioural science is it's much steeper than I suppose maths or classical economics would argue. So what Klarna do so cleverly is they push a lot of the pain of payment into the future. So if you go to a website and you're told, there's a £60 jumper, but you only have to pay £20 today and £40 in the future, people will treat that completely differently than if they have to pay £60 here and now. So part of their appeal is this present bias. But the second thing they do, which I think probably has even wider application, is what I would call temporal reframing, or what you could call the pennies a day effect. And it's the argument that people fixate too much on the headline cash amount, not the number of times they have to pay it. So think of that jumper example. People treat 3 lots of 20 very differently from one hit of 60.
Yeah.
So I did a study probably 10 years ago into this idea. And it was for car rental. So I'll change the number slightly just for ease of my maths. But what we did was show people a picture of a car, and we gave them a description of the car. And some people were told cost £365 a year to rent. Some were told £30 a month, some £7 a week, some £1 a day. So everyone sees the same product, but they're given the price in a slightly different format. Now, if you annualised those amounts, £1 a day is the same as £365 a year. So when we asked people how good value they thought the car was, you should see roughly similar answers. But that is not what happened. People who saw the annual price, 11% thought it was good value. People who saw the daily price, 51% thought it was good value. So you get this massive 4- or 5-fold change in a valuation of item, even though the absolute cost stays the same. And what seems to be happening is people fixate on that headline number. They don't put enough emphasis on the unit of time. So it's like people think 3 times 12 is different from 12 times 3.
Yeah.
So if you want to sell a product that is comprised of many different units or is sold over time, what you really want to do is break that price down to the smallest possible time unit. Don't sell your broadband on it being £30 a month. Tell people it's £7 a week. Don't sell your beer saying it's £24 for a 24-pack. So it's £24, that's the same as £1 a can.
We see this with things like the way subscriptions, I was just listening to a podcast the other day and they were trying to get me to join their club, and it was like, just for the cost of a pint every week. Oh, that sounds reasonable. And but it's the same principle, I guess.
Exactly, because I think that's what's happening. If you hear it's £7 a week, think, well, that's about a pint of lager in a fancy
Unfortunately,
central pub.
in the West End pub, yes.
If you think it's £365 a year, you think, oh my God, that's a fancy weekend away.
A flight, yeah.
What we're very good at, I think, is turning the headline cost into a concrete item. What we're very bad at is multiplying it up enough times to make it realistic. So you're absolutely, it's such a simple tactic, that yes, is applied to some degree, but there's lots of opportunity to apply it far more.
A couple more examples I want to run through that look at slightly different areas. So the next one is liquid death. I'm sure many of our listeners know the liquid death, very sort of buzzy brand over the last few years. Started out in canned water and very sort of well known for its sort of very distinctive advertising style, completely different to anything else in the category. You talk about two specific effects with relation to liquid death. You call them the Van Restorff effect and the red sneakers effect. Just talk to us about those.
So the von Restorff effect is a very, very old idea. So the initial research was done back in 1933 by Hedwig von Restorff at the University of Berlin. And what she did was, and I'll bastardize the study slightly, but basically she gave people a list of information. So you might see a list of 10 items, 9 of which would be animals, 1 of which would be an item of furniture. She'd take that list away, ask you what you could remember, and you would be disproportionately likely to remember the furniture rather than the animals. Now, her argument is we're hardwired to notice what's distinctive. Mm-hmm. Now, that is a fundamental of attention and noticeability. And even though the initial study was done in 1933, I've done lots of studies that show it still stands today. So what brands should do is think to themselves, what are the category conventions that are widely adhered to? So in cars, it might be, well, visual aesthetics, it's often...
It's always the windy road.
Windy road,
all the classics.
Yeah. Perfume, it might be kind of bizarre surrealism. Bottled water, it might be alpine scenes, healthy men and women, and a see-through glass that you can see the purity of the product. What you want to then do is, once you've identified those conventions, is think which ones need to be there, which ones should be adhered to, and leave them well alone. And then think which are just there as meaningless pieces of tradition. And what Liquid Death did so well is identify that an awful lot of the supposedly necessary ways of behaving in the water category, alpine scenes, running, babbling brooks, beautiful greenery, yoga mums, all these things didn't need to be there. It was just a lack of imagination on the existing brand's part. They behaved in a completely radically different way. And even, if you look at their ads, randomly stick Liquid Death into Google, look at YouTube, look at one of their ads, it will be, heavy metal aesthetic, gross carnage and humour. It's completely different. And it is one of the most surefire techniques for generating attention.
And so red sneakers?
Red sneakers is
similar?
It's similar, and it's the idea that not only does breaking convention gain attention, it also makes you higher status. Now, the initial work done by Francesca Gino wasn't debunked per se, but she was involved in a scandal. She got fired by Harvard. I think she might be suing Harvard for that. But Harvard decided she had faked some of her results. Now, the faking was not on the red sneaker paper, but it did cast a bit of doubt about it. So back when I wrote Illusion of Choice, I worked with Duncan Willits and Sumram Kaul, where we reran the study that she did with a slight different twist. And we showed it was a genuine find. It didn't have the biggest of increases. But yes, if you broke a convention, people assumed you were high status.
It's interesting in luxury, isn't it? Because so many luxury brands obey the same codes and they're supposed to be conveying premium status. So I'm just thinking of the current Burberry work, which is completely not of a luxury aesthetic, does break a lot of category conventions, but it does seem like luxury brands are often scared to
I mean, this is we're now going back to Gino's work. And again, this paper wasn't debunked, it was other stuff. But some of the work was done with luxury staff in Milan. So people working in Chanel or Gucci. And what she looked at was their response to people that turned up to the shop who were dressed really scruffily.
Yeah.
And the reaction of people in those stores was to treat the scruffy people as if they were millionaires. Because what a lot of them said is many people are very, very scared of walking into a Chanel store. They'll be nervous. They'll get dressed up for it. If you walk in jogging bottoms and a stretched t-shirt, you are probably so wealthy you don't give a shit about what Chanel think, because you're so secure in your status in a capitalist world. So she actually did some of that initial work with luxury brands. So I think it can certainly work in that area if you pick the right categories to break, and you do it knowingly.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, last example is Pringles, the crisp or chip brand, depending on where you are. Now you use what is called the Keats heuristic here, and I just want to sort of focus on that bit, because I think there's something really interesting here that brings us back into the world of classic advertising. So talk to us about that.
So the Keats heuristic, named after the poet, it was first experimented on in the 1990s by Matthew McGlone and I think it's Jessica Toffig-Bash. I might have got that name slightly wrong. And what they do is they recruit a group of people and they give them fake proverbs. And the difference is you might see a list which has the phrase, woes unite foes, that's the rhyming version. And I might see it as woes unite enemies. So let's imagine we see 10 proverbs, 9 are the same, but you see woes unite foes, I see woes unite enemies. We are then tasked with rating how believable, how credible are the insights of those proverbs. And what they find is there is a significant difference. So from memory, I think it's about a 17 or 20% increase in believability if the phrases rhyme. The argument from the psychologists is people are conflating two things. They're conflating the ease of processing, rhyme just kind of flows over us very smoothly. They're conflating ease of processing with truth. Interestingly, the participants don't know that's what's happening. When people are questioned about why they believe the proverbs, they are directly asked, this one, woes unite foes, it rhymed. Do you think that made you believe it more? Of all the participants in the study, every single participant, bar one, said the rhyme had nothing to do with it. I was just influenced by the inherent meaning of
the
that
brilliance
phrase.
of the thinking.
Yeah. So people don't realise what's influencing them. Now that I think is fascinating for a number of reasons. Firstly, because getting believability is an absolutely core task of a brand. Yeah. Yet fewer than ever adds rhyme. But then secondly, I always loved that study because when I first read about it, I thought, okay, believability is important, but if you were going to ask me why rhyme is so good, I wouldn't have even thought of believability. I'd have just gone to memory. Yeah. So I've done it twice now, first with an unrepresentative audience and then for Hacking the Human Mind with a representative one. So John Paulston, Nicky Morley and I recruited a group of people, showed them the proverbs that were used in that McGlone study, and then some people would see rhyme, some not, ask people what they could remember at a later date, and we saw people were much, much more likely. I think it was about 3 times more likely to remember the rhyming phrase than the non-rhyming phrase. So I love it because whenever people come across these studies, they can often think, okay, well, the study doesn't show exactly what I want, or it's in a wildly different category, or it's done 100 years ago. If you ever think that, don't think these studies are things that you either accept or dismiss. The third option is rerun the study yourself. All the information's in the public domain. Next time you have a survey going out with a bit of clever jiggery-pokery, you can test many of these findings, see if they work for the challenges that you're facing. That's really interesting. And just to close the circle, I guess the link to Pringles is once you pop, you can't stop. But I just think it's fascinating because, as exactly you say, there's been this push to get people to think more about jingles, about those sorts of things. Oh, we've this sort of lost art. Yeah. It's not. It is about memory, but actually there might be something more going on there than just memory. It might be about, as you say, believability. It's really interesting. Yeah, it's a lovely area where there are kind of 2 benefits. And in many ways, the things that like children's writers or advertised in the 1950s, things that they have done for eons to boost memorability based on their gut feeling, instinctively based on gut feeling. You can then put them into test conditions and see they genuinely affect believability of memory. Joanna Stanley and I, maybe 2 years ago, we reran the test but using alliterating phrases versus non-alliterating ones. And we saw not the same magnitude as with rhyme, but a statistically significant increase in both believability and memorability for the alliterating phrases. So a lot of the stuff that copywriters have known for years, that sometimes decision makers in businesses will overrule, many of those things the copywriter is suggesting, that they're well proven.
Rooted in sort of human behaviour.
Insight, yeah.
Richard, fascinating. Thank you so much. Where can people get the book?
Anywhere books are sold. So
all
Amazon,
good bookstores. Will there be
Watsons,
interesting price framing?
Amazon are big fans of a charm price.
Of course.
Expect it to be $13.99 or $12.99.
Nice, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you all for watching or indeed listening. That's all we've got time for today. If you like what you heard or indeed saw, then do follow the WARC Podcast on your podcasting platform of choice. Until next time, thanks for listening.